It's 2 o'clock for me here on the East Coast, and I thank you for being here today. We're excited to share a lot of great information with you, and we are going to get started. Let me just hit the record button, and now we are good to go. All right, good afternoon, and thanks for being here. We've got people from all over the country on the call, so remember, we want to make sure we hear from you, your questions, your comments, anything at all that you think will contribute to the webinar. I've got everybody on mute, so right now just sit tight. I can take you off mute if you'd like to talk and have a question. If not, just send those messages through the chat bar that's available on your screen in the GoToWebinar dashboard box. You see the title, you signed up, you know exactly what we're going to talk about today. This is a free webinar, so please take a lot of notes and feel free to reach out to us. Hey, that's me. I'm Mike Fazio. I'm the founder and the CEO of Workforce 180. We do a lot of webinars, and I'll tell you all about them in a minute. But again, we want to hear from you. So in fact, let me give you a chance to speak up right away. I'm not going to call on anybody, but I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and they'll pop up on your screen. And let's see who's in the audience, and this will also help my co-host, Doug Foresta, and he will get the answers from me in a minute. So just see if it's up on your screen, and yes, people are responding. This is a good thing, Doug. Doug, are you there?
Definitely. I am there.
All right.
Can you hear me, Mike?
Cool. All right, good. So most people, 60% are saying this is the first time they've ever been on the call with us for Workforce 180 or with me. It's about 50-50 now. So I guess some people are going to have to laugh at my same corny jokes over and over again. Let's see what else is happening out there. Outside your window right now, folks, what do you see? I see sun, trees, blue sky, green grass. It's a beautiful day here in the Northeast, sunny and warm in the 80s. What do you see? So people are saying they see their town. But most people, Doug, and this should be of no surprise to you, most people are saying they sit in a windowless cubby.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, there's nobody with a view of blue water, and only I think 1 or 2 people are saying mountains right now. I've got another question for you, folks. Why are you interested in podcasting? I'm interested in podcasting for what? For what reason? So is it for yourself, for your organization? I'm glad everybody's saying organization because this is geared towards organizations. This webinar today is all geared towards setting up your own organizational podcast, workforce podcast. So everybody said organization, which is good. Let's see. When it comes to current podcast listening, what are your listening habits? Every day, every week, every month? When are you listening to podcasts? Most people, Doug, this is going to be interesting right now. Let's wait for the votes to come in. So I'm getting 20% every day, 30% every week, 20% every month, and about 20% say never.
That's a good sign, actually. That's great.
Okay, so we've got a pretty mixed audience here, people who are used to hearing podcasts and people who have never done it, so I guess there's a curiosity factor there. And let me just see, and this question here, I'm here mostly to learn what? I'm here mostly to learn what? Which one of these is most important to you on the podcast webinar today? We want to make sure we cover that. And right now, most people are saying to see if the podcast has workforce value. Workforce value is still in the lead. Workforce value is way in the lead. So this is a good thing. So people are curious, which makes for an interesting topic then. Let me see if I have one more question up here. Yeah, let's just see this. Well, how about yourself out there, audience members? Would you ever like to be a guest or have been a guest on a webinar before? Let's see what people are saying. And most people are saying, sure, why not?
We got a lot of adventurous people. That's great.
I tell you, since we're recording this session, this is actually their first chance to be on the podcast themselves. All right, folks, let's get rolling here. This is us. We're Workforce 180, a 10-second commercial for ourselves. We do webinars and all kinds of training and keynotes and workshops and consulting strictly for workforce organizations. So if it is your first time engaging with us, know that everything we do will be in workforce language because everything we do is for workforce organizations. We've got some great webinars coming up. In fact, next week we've got a great 2-part webinar series all about career pathways. And I'll tell you right now, for anybody participating in this webinar, if you sign up for next week's webinar, because it's a pay webinar, we'll give you $20 off. It's usually $99, but since you took time from your day today, whether it's you or someone else from your organization, we'll give you $20 off just because you participated today. If you have any questions about that, we'll give you plenty of chances to get our email address so you can email us questions. So whether it's for you or coworkers or people outside the organization, it's going to be a really fascinating thing about WIOA and career pathways, and it's going to be a really good topic. Our guest speaker today, who is our podcast expert, or as we have it up there, Podcast Doug, we're lucky to have Doug Foresta with us. Doug, I'm going to let you tell everybody about you for a minute, and then we'll get rolling into the content.
All right, sounds good. So I'll just say a little bit, Mike, about I have been podcasting since 2009, which was a bit earlier than a lot of people were podcasting. I've done over, at this point actually, probably over 800 episodes with all kinds of people from New York Times bestselling authors, CEOs of companies, Academy Award winners, and I have coached, trained, and mentored over 1,500 people to start their own, people and organizations to start their own successful podcasts. And yes, I have noticed Podcast Doug because I eat, breathe, and live this. This is what I do day and night. I love podcasting, and I think that by the end of this, you will catch the podcast bug too.
Well, I've never heard somebody so excited about podcasting, so this is a good thing. Now, Marcia is saying she can't hear anything right now. Well, Marcia, everybody else is hearing stuff right now, so I don't know what to tell you. Dial back in maybe, use your telephone instead of the computer, but just to make sure I'm not talking to myself, could somebody text me and say, Mike, we can hear you? Because up on your GoToWebinar dashboard, you have a chance to use telephone or microphone and speakers from your computer. So people are all saying they can hear me, Marcia, so click on telephone, use the telephone number, and then you dial in, and I'm sure you'll hear me loud and clear. Plus, we're recording it, so you'll be able to play it back in the future. We're going to have a special guest hopefully join us in the next half hour or so. We're going to have Ron Painter on, who's the CEO of the National Association of Workforce Boards, to talk about why podcasting is so important to their organization and why he thinks it's so important to workforce as an industry. So when Ron jumps on, we'll come back and talk to him and share why he podcasts and why their organization podcasts. But right now, do you guys know where the word podcast even comes from? Do you have any idea where podcast even comes from? I'm actually going to give you a pop into the poll up on the screen, and let's see if you can guess it correctly. There's three choices up there: personal on-demand broadcast, private on-demand broadcast, people on-demand broadcast. What do you think podcast stands for? Podcast stands for personal, private, or people on-demand broadcast. And it's personal on-demand broadcast. So 75% of the people got it right, Doug. We've got a pretty smart crowd out there.
Yeah,
Doesn't happen all the time, but we've got all the smart folks here with us today, so that's a good thing. Hey, folks, I'm going to go with a little bit of a shock and awe with you right now about why podcasting and why workforce podcasting. Podcasting, first of all, is portable. It can be personalized. You can access it from anywhere. You don't have to sit in the classroom. You don't have to be locked to your desk. You can use it on the go from your laptop, your phone, your PC, from work, home. It doesn't really matter. You could be doing other things while you're listening to a podcast. So this is great for reaching out to job seekers, employers, community members, and it's really, really inexpensive for you to produce and host and share with audiences all around your community, or who knows, maybe it turns into a national audience. You know, audio learning without using a computer is becoming the way people are going to learn. More people today access the internet with their mobile device than they do with their desktop computer. That's a fact, and that fact is never going to change. People are on the go, they're moving, and this methodology of learning and being informed is growing and growing and growing. In fact, people learn different ways, as you know. When you think of auditory learning, you think of I hear and therefore I know. So when you're listening to things on the radio today, whether it's talk show or NPR, when you hear it, you feel you know it. And that's really one of the aspects that podcasting brings to the forefront. As a workforce organization, you should be in the business of getting people to understand who you are in multiple ways. You do it via the web, You do it face-to-face. You do it in print. The one aspect probably missing from your organization is podcasting, giving people a chance to learn. And I'll tell you, I'm a talk radio junkie, and I have been for years. 99% of the time when I'm in the car, it's either sports radio or NPR or some other talk show, because I enjoy that. So if you're trying to connect with an audience that enjoys listening for information and gaining knowledge that way, then podcasting is going to be something you want to consider. You can look up all the statistics, and when Doug starts talking in a few minutes and shares with you how easy it is to set up a podcast and manage a podcast, you're going to understand why so many people are podcasting. In fact, just recently, I think a month or so ago, about 46 or 47 million people downloaded podcasts in one single month, and that's only growing. So you can go through every statistic you want to see online, but there's nothing to indicate podcasting is going to slow down. It's only going to grow. And why will it only continue to grow? Well, because there's so many different ways to access podcasting, whether it's through Apple or other websites, or simply recording something. We'll show you how to do this and pop it on your website. That could be a podcast too. You don't always have to go to iTunes to access a podcast. In fact, we assist organizations, and we ourselves put our podcast up on our website so that people can find it that way. I tell you, people are podcasting in government. You know, I just took 10 of these that we found online that we know are very, very successful, that all have to do with government. And that doesn't even count the National Association of Workforce Boards, which broadcasts its podcast nationwide every single month. There's 10 great ones right there. You'll get a copy of all these slides so you can always see these episodes. Here's an example of where people actually embed the podcast right on their website. If you go to my website at workforce180.com, onto the 180 podcast page, you'll see we've embedded a very short podcast that Doug and I recorded recently and just put it up there, and we'll continue to add to that library as we see fit. And here's just another example of people talking about workforce on podcasts. This was the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta who embedded their podcast and also added a transcript so that people can read while they listened, or read before they listened, or read after they listened to focus in on a certain aspect of the podcast. When you're sharing information with people, as you know, folks, they're gaining more insight as to who you are. They're becoming more interested in who you are. They're more likely to work with you if they know who you are and better understand. And I know from working with workforce organizations around the country for years, one of the biggest challenges we have with community members and employers is they really don't know what we do. And I don't know about you, but the days of reading flyers have kind of come to an end. People are busy. Flyers are piled up on their desk. They're not going to read about it. They're more apt to listen or look on the web and either observe or listen on the web, or even maybe watch a video. So that's the way workforce is moving too. And here's just another example of all kinds of job search podcasts that are out there. So job search podcasting is really, really popular. You as a workforce organization can share, again, information, tips, instructions on how to job search, or any topic that you do in a classroom, you can share in a podcast. Even if it turns out to be a reinforcement mechanism to reinforce what you shared in the class, to reinforce what you have posted up on your website. Remember, people learn by listening. When they hear it, they feel they know it. And it's not always in a classroom setting. And here's just more and more and more and more and more. So this has to do with nonprofit podcasting. And there's tons of nonprofit podcasts out there. So for those of you who are new to the podcast world, this is really, I hope, evidence that podcasting is very alive and very well and very much being used by government agencies and nonprofits alike. They're using this platform because it's inexpensive, it's easy to do, and it's really effective. So right now, I know in workforce we're usually a couple of steps behind when it comes to technology and trending things. But once we catch up, we're really good at doing things. It was only a few years ago that most workforce professionals didn't have smartphones, didn't have access to social media at work. And now I see it happening everywhere. They're using texting to contact customers, especially youth. And they're using the internet now to deliver online learning classes. So why not add podcasting to your repertoire to make sure that you're reaching people? Here's an example of how you can download for free podcasts on iTunes, and we'll get to this a little bit more later on, and you'll see there's just another screenshot of how to subscribe to a podcast online. So for those of you who had to do this stuff, it's just to remind you or show you that we also know about these things, and maybe we could teach you a few extra tricks. But having that Workforce podcast and why you need to have it is really why you're here today. So at this point, I want to turn over the more detailed part of the webinar to Podcast Doug so that he could share with you some of the tips and tricks that he's done over the years. And bear in mind, Doug is a workforce consultant. He builds workforce podcasts. He manages workforce podcasts. He distributes workforce podcasts. So part of this webinar is information, and part of this webinar is to connect Doug with possible opportunities that exist out in the workforce world. So at the end of the webinar, we'll pop his email address up on the screen. It's pretty easy, doug@workforce180.com. But we'll pop it up on the end of the screen, and hopefully you will make contact with him and see if your existing podcast is in good shape, or would you like him to take a look at it? Or would you like him to help you build a brand new podcast and get yourself all set up and going? So Doug, 3 questions, okay? Yes. And we talked to a lot of our customers out there, and this is what we concluded the big 3 questions are out there. So in podcasting, especially for workforce, who's the ideal listener? For me, as a novice, right, I'm going to say everybody's a potential listener.
Right. And if you say that, I'll tell you right now, Mike, when people go, oh, my podcast is going to be great because everybody needs to hear it. If everybody needs to hear it, then nobody's going to hear it. Podcasting is all about niche. It's all about niching down. And so if you're in a community, you know, every workforce agency is going to have a little different ideal listener because everyone has a different challenge or within their region. So knowing who your ideal listener is and really getting specific is very, very important to have a successful
All right, so that's an important thing you said, to be really specific. So is it important for us, let's say, you know, workforce organizations will serve all different people with barriers, whether it's young people, older people, long-term unemployed people, veterans. Is it best to stick with it with a group like that, or is it best to stick to a topic such as resume building, job search strategies, how to impress an employer? Where would you suggest, from your experience, that people direct their energies if they had to strategize in their marketplace?
Right. So it would definitely be, for example, let's say that I live in Massachusetts, right? So, and I live specifically in the western part of the state in Massachusetts. So I would think about what are some of the challenges, the economic challenges, the job challenges that, yes, different groups are facing, right? It might be young people, it might be veterans, but there's probably some common challenges that are going on in my region. And so knowing what those are and then targeting it. So when I say ideal listener, it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, 18-year-olds who wear sunglasses. It's really thinking about what are the challenges in your region that the groups you serve, the people you serve, might be having.
Okay, good. So that comes down to a lot of the things I hear you talk about all the time, which is really strategizing, planning, not just getting on the air and saying, so what should we talk about today? It's not like a talk show host who's got to talk 5 hours every day, 5 days a week, where they just kind of wing it a lot of the times. If you're going to record a webinar once a month and you're going to record 20 minutes, you better really have some determined content that you want to share and target to an audience. Is that fair to say?
That is, and I'll give you the other side of that, is when you do that well, and I've seen people do this with 5-minute podcasts or 10-minute podcasts, somebody goes, that was exactly what I needed to hear. I'm coming in to learn more. And that, so it doesn't have to be, like you said, it doesn't have to be, you know, people think, oh, I can't do, 5-day-a-week, podcasts for hours. It doesn't have to be long. It really has to speak to challenges that the person that you're talking to would face.
Okay, good. Second question. So what are your listeners' biggest challenges or questions related to workforce? So what are your listeners' biggest challenges or questions related to workforce? So for us in the workforce, and I'll take some of this, Doug, when it comes to listeners, their biggest issue with me is, how do I get to a podcast? I've heard the word, but how do I listen to a podcast? So in fact, let me see if I've got an audience member out there that podcasts on a regular basis and see. Let's see. I have Jason. Or is that Bubba? Who's on the line? You have to take me off of mute over there. It's either Jason Jones or Bubba. I've got you guys off of mute.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, we can. Who's this?
Hey, this is Jason Jones at the Workforce Investment Board in Joplin. And we don't podcast in the formal sense of like having RSS feeds and such, but we put out a lot of video content from our different workshops, you know, conferences we host and events that we cover. You know, say the governor comes in town to kick off an event for one of our employers or a campaign for one of our, you know, work readiness initiatives, then Bubba and the web, we record those and put those out like on Vimeo and YouTube and such. That's
great. You post that, I'm guessing you post that up on your social media as well, on Facebook with hyperlinks and on your website?
That is correct.
Okay, good. And the consideration you're giving to a podcast is because it would be another form of content to share with your audience?
Yes, and we want to get a little more formal in the sense of, you know, we probably, in fact, we're chatting back and forth on text because we're in different locations right now, but kind of talking about one audience for our, you know, external stakeholders, employers, economic development, education, so forth, and then the other audience would be students and job seekers. And so even repurposing content and bringing in, you know, new ideas with our sector-ready pathways initiatives and that kind of thing, it's in essence to maybe, you know, get the word out on new products and things that we'll have coming up with WIOA and such.
Yeah, well, I think it's smart that you're looking to diversify how you share the information, and to do a sector approach is even smarter because not everybody's going to be interested in the topic you pop up there, but if you had multiple topics geared towards multiple people, then obviously you get a bigger bang for your buck. That's really smart, and it's good to hear it. It's good to hear that things are happening out there in Joplin. So thanks for joining us. I'll pop you back on mute, okay?
Cool, you bet.
Okay, Doug, so people ask, you know, what's the value of me having, as an organization, a point of view? Shouldn't we just be neutral or agnostic in how we share information? Or should we be a little opinionated and be a little bit more passionate when we speak on a podcast?
Well, let's think about it this way. Think about, for example, now podcasting is not radio, but at the same time, think about, for example, I think of, you know, people that have been very successful on radio or people that have been very successful even on YouTube or social media. You do have to have a point of view, right? We don't want someone who's just bland or neutral. And what's really exciting to me is, you know, you could have 1,000 workforce development podcasts out there, and each one of those podcasts can be very different and have and serve different people and have a unique point of view. So your point of view is really, it's your take on workforce, it's your take on, let's say, your local environment. But yes, you do have to have a point of view. I always say that, you know, one of the things that's important is that you have to, if you're going to do podcasting, you have to have a personality. But fortunately, everyone has a personality. You know.
I might debate that with you someday, but that's okay. I think you're right, and you know, your brand gets impacted by the personality you share with whatever form of media you use. So I see some workforce organizations' websites that are very official looking, very bland, very, you know, government-like. And then I see some that are taking more risks and they're being more adventurous and they have cleaner, newer, you know, designs and themes to them. And it automatically gives me a different feeling towards the organization, maybe no better or worse than the other organization, but I'm starting to understand their view of things. They're trying to express they're a little bit more progressive and they're trying a little bit harder and they want to be more than beige and gray, but they actually want to be green, blue, and red as well. And that to me is part of what podcasting can be. It could be very bland and just informative, or it could be view-oriented where they're sharing opinions and advice and they're bringing on guests who will also stimulate conversation and interest, and especially locally where communities are so different. Colorado Springs is a lot different than Memphis, Tennessee, and obviously it's a lot different than Brooklyn, New York. So each audience is going to have a different ear towards the content. So I think it's really important that the podcast creators who are planning and strategizing understand who they're talking to and maybe understand how they want to hear things.
And God forbid, might I say this, it might even be fun. You know?
Well, fun and work sometimes go hand in hand, but
Yeah.
remember, this is government and workforce development. We try not to smile too much, and folks, I say that totally in a joking manner. I know that our jobs aren't always fun, but it doesn't mean that on the job we can't really be enjoying what we're doing, so please just take that as a joke. Okay, so I keep hearing from my customers, and folks, just so you know, we have customers in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and starting in October, we go to Canada. So we're truly a national and now international workforce consulting organization. And this year alone, we've had over 150 organizations work with us who are workforce, nonprofit, and government agencies. So we're really proud of that, and I'm not saying to impress you, but really just impress on you that when we get a customer, we really try and extract opinions and advice from them so that we continue to get better at what we do. So let's go through these one by one, Doug, okay? So
Right.
Myth number one, I need expensive equipment to do a podcast. I need a studio. I need all kinds of gear.
And the reality is you can go down to Staples or Best Buy with $30 and you can get the equipment that you need to have clear sound for your podcast. And I recommend this Logitech H390 headset, which really, if you go to Staples and pull out a headset, that's the most likely one that you need. You already have, I believe that most people already have a desktop computer and a laptop. That's really the equipment that you need to start a podcast.
So I guess you could have a studio and you could have fancy microphones and you could have all those things, but
Right.
I've heard your podcast over and over again, and you know, this kind of equipment, really the quality is great. And as technology keeps improving and it's all digital sound on your computer, and I know the stuff that you manage on the back end for customers makes it even easier for them. So you're saying for $30, they can get a headset, you know, aside from if they were one of your customers as a consultant, but equipment-wise, this is really all they need.
Yeah, you do not need to go build a radio studio inside your, yeah, please don't, you know.
All right, put the charge cards away, everybody. All right, here's myth number two. Aren't all podcasts really long and boring and people just drone on and on and on?
Well, that's kind of my passion, is to help people not have long, boring podcasts. So, yeah, there are some long and boring podcasts. There's long and boring blogs and long and boring videos. But they do not have to be, nor should they be, long and boring. And 20 to 25 minutes is really great because that's the amount of time when you talk about people multitasking, if they're working out or they're taking a lunch break or they're going to work or leaving work, 20 to 25 minutes, also 22 minutes is the average U.S. commute. It's a amount of time where people can really say, I'll listen to this. If I said to you, Mike, oh, I've got this great audio, it's an hour long, you have to listen to it, what would you say to me?
Doug, if I had an hour, I would not be listening to your podcast for an hour straight. No. Unless I was in the car, but even then it's hard to stay focused because the phone's ringing or I'm already at my destination. So an hour is a lot to ask of people, which is why I guess YouTube came up with that 15-minute concept, and you know why Twitter is 140 characters, is that in today's world we're all multitasking, so we really need to digest things quickly and then move on to the next project.
That's exactly
right. And I think like you point out here on the screen, if they really want more information, you can direct them maybe to the website where maybe you have the full version of the podcast or additional versions of the podcast if they really wanted to get some more content from you. And you gave a great tip here if you want to go through this one.
Yeah, and this is, I want to use an example of music. Have you ever heard a new artist and you just hear like a clip of their new song and you go, oh my gosh, I have to get this, whatever they call it now, right, album, or I've got to get the rest of this. You want to, it's not the length of time that makes your podcast successful. It's that people say, that was great, that really spoke to me, I like this person's voice, I like the way Mike sounds, he sounds like he cares about me, they're doing great work, I want to learn more, let me go check it out.
Okay, good. So everything doesn't have to be really long and overly produced and on and on and on. We're just looking for something 20 to 25 minutes so it fits in with a commuting schedule or a lunch break or a drive home or, you know, just some downtime in your office. You know, we always share with workforce organizations, Doug, that if they gave their staff a break every day for 16 minutes, strictly for learning, whether it's listening to a podcast, reading an article, watching some video, 16 minutes a day equates to about 100 hours a year of learning, and the average workforce professional gets about 32 hours a year of training.
Wow.
So if they got 100 hours of learning, I guarantee folks, we believe, or strongly believe, that your staff gets smarter and better and more productive. Okay, let's move on to the next, the myth number 2. So myth number 2, podcast, well, we already did myth number 2. Myth number 3, podcast formats are confusing. Should I do it by myself? Should it be a panel of people? Should it be me having guests all the time? I don't think I could talk for 22 minutes straight. What's the deal here?
What I recommend, and I think this works well for a lot of people, so there's basically three possible ways you could do this. I can speak on a podcast myself, right, and people hear Doug. I can interview Mike, right, and that's an interview format, or I can do both, and I can have episodes where it's just me speaking as the expert, and I can bring on experts. And what I recommend is I think that the hybrid model of doing some podcasts where it's you and some where it's the other person. So yeah, an interview-based podcast, interviewing people, the hybrid, and I really like the hybrid model, but it doesn't need to be confusing. There's basically, you can speak, you can interview, or you can do both, and I really like the both model.
Okay, good. So the both model allows the audience to hear different voices, much like you and I are trying to do right now, so it's not just focused on one person. You know, for me as a sports radio listener, it's interesting because sometimes there's teams of guys who do or host a sports radio show. You know, they're a twosome. And then every once in a while, one of the guys calls in sick or he's just off that day, and that person is solo, and it's a totally different experience. It's totally different when that team is now one. Or vice versa, that solo person has a teammate for an hour or two on their radio show. It totally changes the dynamic of things. So, of course, I'm going to agree with you that the hybrid, where you do some solo and some team stuff, is enough to really keep the audience interested and engaged. And listen, for a workforce podcast, you have an unlimited number of potential guests, whether it's local employers, local government officials, whether it's people inside your own workforce organization. Hey, folks, let me tell you what a case manager does on a regular basis. Or let me tell you how our business service representatives connect with employers in the local community. Or let me talk to you, let me just share with you right now our events coordinator who's got a great hiring event coming up next month that we want to talk to you about, not just next month, but what's happened in previous months. Hey, let me introduce you to our executive director. He's going to share with you really what the workforce development system does to work for you in the local community. So to me, there's an unlimited amount of guests, but I do agree that every once in a while it's nice to fly solo when I do them, so that I can get a point of view across to people and share with them information I think is of value. All right, and let's go on to the fourth one here, podcast Doug. I need a studio to record my podcast. Well, since before you said you only need a set of headphones, talk about some of the, let me go back here a bit. Talk about what people really need to get going if they're going to do this from the comfort of their own office or a conference room somewhere.
Right. So one of the questions people ask all the time is, if I'm doing interviews, how do I do that? Do I need to build a sound set inside my, inside our workforce organization? No. You can. Most people, almost every computer has Skype on it already, and what you're basically doing is you're recording Skype conversations. That's going to give you the best audio quality at a very affordable price because Skype is free, right? So it doesn't get.
Well, you can't get cheaper than free, I guess.
You can't get cheaper than free. No. So you're basically you're using a Skype recorder, and there's either these that you can see here. These are some ways to record Skype. They have for PC and Mac, and you're simply recording the conversation with that person. You can be anywhere. They can be anywhere in the world, really.
So they can be on a mobile phone. It doesn't really matter. Call quality matters, of course, but
yes,
you can still
I don't recommend using a mobile phone. That's the only thing I really don't recommend is using a cell phone, because cell phone coverage is spotty, and so I recommend using Skype or a landline. If someone can use Skype, you can Skype from your mobile phone, so you could do that.
Yes, I've done that before myself, so I know it works. And you're putting some technical stuff up here about Audacity and all that, but I'm going to suggest people contact you direct if they really want some more details on what all this stuff does, because we just don't have the platform, I think, to make that available to people. But you can use a Mac or a PC, and that headset, Skype, and Audacity is really all you need to get rolling. So I want you to share with people what you did since it looks like Ron got tied up. I know he's in Texas today at a meeting, and he said he was going to jump on if he could, but we wanted him and you to talk about what you did for the Knob Workforce Central podcast to help it be better than it was. It was pretty good, I think, but obviously you went in and did a major overhaul. So do you want to talk about that? This is what you found the way it was, right? And talk about some of these things.
Sure. And Workforce Central, Knob is very interested. They're very interested, of course, they're the national organization. They're very interested in moving forward the agenda of workforce development and stimulating conversation. But the problem was they were only on 2 distribution channels. You could find them on Blog Talk Radio, and you could sort of find them on their website. And they were doing these long interviews. And in the last, in early 2015, I mean, they were getting maybe 50 downloads a month or 100 downloads a month. They were not getting the kind of engagement that they should be getting for an important topic and being a national organization. So they just didn't have it set up. They were doing live recordings, which I don't recommend. It's much better to do pre-record. So they had, you're absolutely right. I mean, there were some really powerful things. Ron is a great interviewer, but they definitely were leaving a lot on the table. They just weren't reaching nearly as many people as they could reach, and their format wasn't optimized for podcasting.
Okay, good. So it sounds like it wasn't in the right places to be seen, and then some of the length of the podcast probably was scaring people off because they were doing 60 minutes or longer podcast interviews, which would be enough to scare me off.
Right, just like we had talked about.
So just a couple of minor tweaks, and give yourself some credit because you took over the whole situation, and now this is what happens with their podcasting. So you went in, did an overhaul, and fixed everything for them, and now I'll let you go.
Well, now they're in so many more places. I mean, now people can find them on iTunes, and they could find them in all, on YouTube and many, many more places. So, and we're growing those distribution channels every day. So, one of the things you want to be everywhere. Now they're working on being everywhere. There's lots of ways that people can download their podcast. They've doubled their number of downloads in the first 30 days, and we're going to double that again in the next 30 days. People can access the podcast now from any mobile device. They're driving more traffic to their web page. They're getting engagement again. They're picking up new listeners. They're people who are in the business and economic sector, leading people that are influencers are starting to listen to the podcast and take notice. And just this morning, actually, Mike, I was on Twitter, and somebody, one of the leading business person said, "Thanks Workforce Central for all the great info." So now they're starting to get the listeners again. They're starting to get engagement, and that's what they wanted in the first place. So we really took them from where basically the podcast was dying to really growing it and getting that engagement and listeners and excitement.
Yeah, and listen, in fairness to them, you've got a CEO, a senior vice president. You only got a few people at NAWB, and they only have so much time in a day. So the fact that they actually had a podcast going was impressive. More impressive is they reached out for help, and that's where we got involved, and you got involved, and now they have they outsource how to have their podcast managed, which obviously has helped because you've been able to get them, set up, and this is a screenshot, of their Twitter account, how they distribute their podcast?
175 followers in 7 days, and those are business and government and economic stakeholders, and that's continuing to grow. We're on target to add 600 Twitter followers a month to podcast Workforce Central Twitter account. So it's creating, it's not just the podcast, it's all of the excitement and buzz that comes from the podcast. Here's an example of trending hashtags for workforce, and you can look at this. It's all, it's all people. It's either us sharing or people sharing Workforce Central. So you can do this. I mean, you can do this in your community, in your region, and you can become that person that everyone's talking about. You can become that organization. This is iTunes New and Noteworthy, which is like the New York Times bestseller list for podcasts. You can see Workforce Central here is number 6. It's in the top 10. This was like immediately after launch, they hit the new and noteworthy section. And this is where people again will find you because it's a prominent list of important podcasts in government, and any workforce organization could be in this new and noteworthy.
Okay, good. So it could be everywhere, really, is what you're saying. Yeah, it could be everywhere. So, and iTunes is obviously the place people are most familiar with, but, it sounds like, to me, not to minimize what you did, but you really need to make a commitment and a campaign.
Correct.
To get your podcast heard, downloaded, followed, and people to pick up momentum that this is going to be something they want to listen to whenever they post a new episode. It's not something you just do and throw out there and then cross your fingers.
No, and like you said too, the other piece is that NOB is a national organization. They have a lot of other things going on. They recognize the value of podcasting, but podcasting is what I do, right? So it's like, do workforce well, and create a great podcast. But the rest of it, it's like, do you want to learn every nuance of every part of podcasting?
Yeah, I see. Okay, good. So, Doug, I like this quote of yours out there. Podcasting is all about planning content and very little about technology and equipment, though the focus is on the latter. So I think what you're saying here is that most people are so concerned about the mechanics that they lose sight of the fact that the planning the content is probably the most important part. They bring in guys like you who handle all the mechanics of setting up and, well, what do we have here on the slide? You do everything, right? You could build somebody's podcast, you could produce it, you can co-host it, you can distribute it, you can manage it. All they have to do is come up with the content, I guess.
That's exactly right.
So the value of having somebody like you do this for them is you kind of get them going with training wheels, and then probably after some time period you can take the wheels off and they can go do it on their own. But why not outsource it, especially if it's affordable? It's not free. You're not free. You don't work for free, do you? You're not independently wealthy,
are you?
No,
I haven't done that yet. No, not working for free yet.
So
I do think, though, I will say this, Mike. I think that what we're offering is very reasonable. It's a very reasonable, when you think about the value of what a podcast can bring to your organization. I think it's extremely reasonable.
Well, listen, it's like anything else that people have to start and try and build and pay for sometimes, is that you got to make a commitment to it. You've got to decide you're going to go for it. It's like when I talk about employer engagement, if I'm doing an employer engagement workshop, it's not something you just do for a day or a week or a month. It's something you make a commitment to if you really want to get good at it and you really want to get better at whatever you're doing today. You just don't call employers one day. You call them all the time. You follow up. You write good proposals. You campaign. You make sure your brand is more aware of out there. You follow up some more. You hold hiring events. You put on, opportunities for them to meet job seekers or come in and take a tour of the facility or be a guest speaker at a workshop. There's a lot of effort that goes into something if you want to be really good at it and not just try it. I would say people could try podcasting, but my opinion, you could tell me if you disagree, is that you don't just put your toe in the water. You've got to jump in and make a commitment to do this, and it's much easier than people think from what you're telling me. That's
right. That's exactly right.
All right, so let's go out to the audience because I think we're having Ron Painter dial in right now, and he can share a few words about why it's so important for workforce organizations to get involved with podcasting. But folks, if you've got a question for Doug, right now is a good time to use your chat board. Type in the question to me, and then we can have Doug be the expert and answer it until Ron Painter hops on the line. So what questions do you have for Doug, Podcast Doug? Doug, Podcast Doug. Doug, you usually got to wait about 30 seconds for the questions to pop up on the screen.
No problem.
But I've got a question for you right here. Who was the Academy Award winner that you interviewed on your podcast?
I've actually interviewed several, but one of them is Rob Freed. He is the executive. He used to run Savoy Pictures. He was the CEO of Savoy Pictures, and he is the executive producer of Rudy, Hoosiers, Collateral, Godzilla, among many others.
Wow, cool. So when you started podcasting back in 2009, what was the biggest, this is somebody writing this, what was the biggest challenge you faced in knowing what to say? So I guess some people might be a little apprehensive about what they're going to say when they're on the air, so to speak.
Right. And that, I think that is the biggest challenge, is definitely, and that is something that we definitely can help with as well. I wanted to say that, in terms of the consulting piece of what do we say and that part of it. But one easy way to figure it out, I think I did it I had to do it the banging my head against the wall way, because there wasn't a me back then. But the easiest way to do it is talk to the people that you already work with and just listen to them. What do they want to know? And you don't have to become the people worry that, oh my God, what am I going to say? Just answer the questions that people are already asking you.
Well, I think you're right about it. I think just being yourself and trying to be natural and not trying to be such a wordsmith when you answer a question is, to me, the thing I've learned when I do these webinars, and we do them all the time,
Right.
is just be yourself, and
Right.
You're going to be just fine. Hey, somebody asked an interesting question here. Is there any kind of app or a headset that you recommend to record using a smartphone instead of a laptop? So I guess, can people record? I guess you can, because there's digital recorders on smartphones these days.
Correct.
Is that something? Yeah, go ahead.
If you're doing a solo podcast, you can absolutely record on your smartphone. You just have to make sure some of those apps, if it goes over like 5 minutes, you can't export. Make sure you can export the audio off your phone. Like, make sure you can get the audio off your phone, but there are definitely apps. As far as interviewing over the phone with your smartphone, it's still not really there yet. I would love that, and when that happens, I will let you know, but it's not really quite there yet. You really need...
Well, I think the question's interesting, because I'll tell you, a lot of times as I'm driving by myself, I do practice out loud a speech
Right.
that I'm going to give, or some thoughts that I have, just to hear that. So I guess it would be interesting if I had a headset, which I do, with a microphone, which I do, that plugs into my smartphone. Could I record while I'm talking into my smartphone and then upload that recording and use it as my podcast platform, maybe with a little bit of editing? And I guess the answer is going to be yes, right?
The answer is 100% yes. You can also, one of the things that Ron is doing is, one of the things we have him doing is, we got a $20 digital voice recorder, and he talks right into that wherever he is, if he has ideas, and those become podcast episodes. But yes, you can use your smartphone.
I tell you, I got myself a digital voice recorder when Radio Shack was going out of business. It was like a $90 recorder I got for $20, and I use it myself as well. Here's another question that came in. This comes in from Bubba. Is there any hard and fast rule on how often you should podcast?
Right. The answer
should it be daily, weekly,
right.
monthly? Like, what is there a kind of a rule that people abide by?
So the answer is, you really get to decide based on what works for you and how busy you are in your organization. But what you said, Mike, about consistency. So if you decide it's going to be monthly, you can't miss months. Whatever you do, choose something that you're going to commit to. The commitment is key. I would rather see someone commit to once a month than say, oh, I'm going to do it every day and not do it at all.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And a part B to that, Bubba also asked, do you have any problem with recording multiple sessions for future broadcasts? So is there any reason you can't record, save it, and then post it a week later or a month later, whatever schedule you're on?
Right, and that was one of the things that Knob wasn't doing. They were doing them live. And not only is there not a problem, yes, do that. Get ahead with the content. That's how you don't get, you can do, 2 months worth of content in a day if you want. Absolutely. Yes, do that.
Hey, look, the one thing I'm hearing is that podcasting isn't going away. It's not just the future anymore. It's today. It's affordable. It's manageable. It's doable. And it's becoming part of what America does to get information. If 46 million people downloaded a podcast last month, that's not a fad. That's a pretty hard fact that says we got to get information online. And I know a lot of young people connect to podcasts because they're so connected to their mobile devices, but mobile devices are part of everybody's life. And when you think about somebody who's a job seeker, who's unemployed, who has a smartphone, it's one of the things that keeps them connected to the world. And I think it would be really cool for a workforce organization to have a series of podcasts, whether they're 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 15 minutes, that are all about job search, resume tips, interviewing tips and things that they can have available at no cost to their job seekers for download onto somebody's device that they can listen to while they're walking around, or while they're sitting around, or while they're driving around, or before they go in on an interview. It's such a motivational opportunity for a workforce center to assist a job seeker so that as soon as they're ready to go in on the interview, they've just listened to that 2-minute podcast that was posted up on a site that said, don't forget to ask this question when you go in on an interview. And with the amount of downloads that happen today, whether it's for music or talk or anything else, there should be no excuse not to do this, in my opinion. And I think in 5 years from now, we're going to see that everybody has done it. But right now, as a workforce industry, we need to start to get caught up with the way the rest of the country is getting their information. It took us a while to catch up to social media, now we're caught up. Now it's time to catch up in other areas, and not just in podcasting, but in video production as well. So one thing at a time, we want you to try and engage with us and talk about how we can assist you in building your workforce podcast. I can tell you right now, Doug is standing by with multiple operators to take your emails, and we'll be happy to set up a private conversation with you to talk about your situation. I know he'll give a free assessment. If you have an existing podcast, he'll give you a free assessment and analysis and proposal of how to improve it. And if you just want to talk about the possibility of starting a podcast, then I suggest that you reach out to him. Folks, I have another couple of minutes to go here. If you'd like to ask a question, apparently Ron's having some technical difficulties in Texas, so we may not be able to get him on the line. But I promise you I will record a podcast with Ron and post that information to the website so that he can share his views as to why he decided to upgrade the podcast for the National Association of Workforce Boards. Doug, I want to thank you for being on the call today. I know you're a very busy person, so thanks for being here. I hope you got something out of this.
Thank you, Mike. You know, anytime that we can talk podcasting and workforce, I'm in.
Good stuff. Everybody else, thanks so much. And don't forget, if you hit our website at workforce180.com and go to 180 Webinar, you will see next week's webinar, and if you sign up by Friday, we'll give you $20 off just because you were here today, so make sure you mention that during the registration. Other than that, folks, thanks again for joining us, and have a fantastic day and a great upcoming weekend. Bye, everybody.